All right, let's go. Number 10, machines that talk back. The warning was in circulation long before there was anything to attach it to. It appeared in the same forms, the same letters, the same interview transcripts that produced the rest of this list, and it was always phrased in roughly the same way. A voice would arrive. It would come from nothing, from no throat and no body. And it would speak with such ordinary human rhythm that the people hearing it would stop asking whether it was human at all. They would simply answer it. For most of the last century, this was the least credible claim any alleged traveler could make. It did not sound like prophecy. It sounded like a magic trick. Machines in the 20th century did not converse. They calculated. They processed. They returned output in the flat, bracketed grammar of a system that had no interest in being understood. The gap between a computer and a conversation was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of category, and every serious researcher in the field said so. In November of 2022, the category dissolved. Generative artificial intelligence reached the public that month in a form anyone could use without training, without credentials, without knowing a single line of code. Within 2 months, the system had accumulated 100 million users. No consumer product in the recorded history of technology adoption had ever moved that fast. Not the telephone, not the television, not the personal computer, the mobile phone, or the social networks that had defined the previous 15 years. The curve was not steeper. It was a different shape entirely. What followed was not a novelty period. It was an integration period. Within 3 years, companies had begun deploying systems described in their own internal documentation as agents, software that does not wait for instruction, but acts. These agents now book appointments. They write and revise working code. They handle customer service inquiries from first contact to resolution without a human being present at any point in the exchange. Major forecasters project that these systems will contribute trillions of dollars to the global economy by the end of this decade. The year that appears most frequently in the industry roadmaps, in the capability projections, in the internal planning documents of the largest laboratories in the field, is 2027. The detail that the alleged travelers always emphasized, however, was not economic. It was acoustic. They described the voice. They described the cadence of it, the fact that it would breathe in the right places, that it would pause before a difficult answer as though considering, that it would carry the small irregularities of human speech that no one has ever consciously noticed and everyone unconsciously requires. Synthetic voices now do all of this. They are smooth, pause perfect, and on a telephone line, routinely indistinguishable from a person. Millions of people have already had a conversation with one without knowing it. Most of them will never find out. What makes this warning particularly unsettling is not that the machines learned to talk. It is that we stopped noticing when they did. 5 years ago, the researchers who study this transition were confident about one thing above all others. They believed the boundary would hold. They believed a person would always know, at some level, whether they were typing to a program or speaking to a colleague. That boundary is now blurring faster than any of them predicted, and it is blurring from both directions. The machines are becoming more human, and the humans, sitting in front of them for 8 hours a day, are becoming easier to satisfy. The travelers said we would not resist it. They said we would find it convenient. Number 9, the vanishing cache. Of all the warnings attributed to visitors from the following decades, this was the one that drew the most ridicule. It was not a warning about weapons. It was not a warning about plague or collapse or the machinery of government failing in the street. It was a warning about money, and specifically about the physical object most people carried in their pockets every day of their lives without ever once considering that it might not be there. The claim was simple. The traveler said that in the era he came from, Cash no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Not banned, not confiscated, not seized in some dramatic act of state. Simply unused. He said the coins and notes would still be legal, still technically valid, still printed for a period after they had ceased to matter, and that this was the reason nobody would notice the transition while it was occurring. He said the currency would not be taken. It would be abandoned. For most of the 20th century, this was an unserious prediction. Cash was the base layer of economic life. It was anonymous, universal, and functional in a blackout. It required no account, no network, no permission from a third party. Economists of the period treated the elimination of physical currency as a thought experiment rather than a trajectory. The prediction was filed alongside the other novelties, and it was forgotten. Then the tap arrived. Contactless payment, followed by the scanned code on a phone screen, became dominant across major markets after 2020. The change took less than 5 years in most places, and less than 2 in some. Sweden and several other nations are now on a documented path toward being effectively cashless, with physical currency used in a shrinking fraction of all transactions, a fraction that continues to shrink annually with no measured floor. Entire countries are approaching the point at which a physical wallet is optional, not illegal, optional. At the same time, and largely without public debate, the institutions that issue money began building the replacement. Central banks, including those of the European Union and China, have been piloting central bank digital currencies for years, with rollouts targeted for the middle and late portion of this decade. These are not private tokens or speculative instruments. They are sovereign currency, issued directly, existing only as a record in a ledger, and settled through a network that has to be operating for the money to function at all. What makes the vanishing cash particularly unsettling is not that money became digital. Most money was already digital. It is what was quietly removed in the exchange. A coin does not know who is holding it. A banknote does not report where it has been, or refuse to be spent on a particular category of goods, or expire, or require the merchant and the buyer to be simultaneously connected to a functioning network in order to complete a transaction between two people standing 3 feet apart. Every one of those properties was a limitation. Every one of those limitations was also a protection, and the protection was never articulated until it was already gone. The sound is what the traveler was said to have described most precisely. The jingle of coins in a pocket, the crinkle of paper handed across a counter. Both of those sounds have been replaced by a single quiet tap, and the tap leaves a record, and the record does not expire. He said the strangest part was how welcome it had been. He said nobody had resisted. He said the entire architecture of anonymous exchange, developed across 3,000 years of human commerce, had been surrendered in under a generation because the alternative was slightly faster at the register. Number 8. The overheating skies. Of all the warnings ever placed in the record, this was the one that came with a date attached. Not a mood, not a vague sense of trouble ahead. A number printed in reports, repeated in classrooms, cited in policy documents for 3 decades. The year was 2050. That was when the heat was supposed to arrive. That was when the models said the storms would sharpen, the droughts would lengthen, the summers would begin to kill people in numbers that governments could not absorb quietly. 2050 was chosen because it was far enough away to be someone else's problem and close enough to sound serious. It sat at a comfortable distance. It belonged to a generation that had not been born yet. Every institution that repeated the figure understood, without saying so, that nobody in the room would be held responsible for it. The warning said the date was wrong. It said the arrival would not be gradual, and it would not wait. It said the first sign would not be a catastrophe, but a series of records, broken not once, but repeatedly, in consecutive years, until the breaking of records stopped being reported as news. It said the second sign would be the smell of smoke in cities that had never burned. It said the third sign, the one nobody would think to watch, would come from the accountants. Global temperature records were shattered repeatedly across 2023 and 2024. Not narrowly, not within the margin of instrumental error. Multiple individual months crossed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the threshold that had been described for years as the line that must not be crossed, the boundary around which entire international agreements had been constructed. It was crossed. It was reported. It was absorbed into the news cycle and displaced within a week. Climate models now flag the late 2020s, not the middle of the century, as the period of intensifying heat waves, droughts, and extreme storms. The problem did not arrive on schedule. It arrived decades early, and it arrived while the schedule was still being printed. What makes this warning particularly disturbing is not the temperature. Temperature is an abstraction. Most people cannot feel a fraction of a degree, and the human body is a poor instrument for detecting a planetary trend. The disturbing part is the accountants. Insurance companies have begun withdrawing coverage from parts of Florida and parts of California, not out of ideology, not out of political conviction. Insurers are the most conservative institutions in commercial life. They exist to price risk accurately, and they are punished immediately and severely when they price it wrong. They have run the numbers on those regions and concluded the risk can no longer be underwritten at any price a homeowner would pay. This is what a warning looks like when it stops being a forecast and becomes an actuarial fact. Not a protest, not a summit. A quiet letter informing a family that their house is no longer insurable. The texture of it is already ordinary. The shimmer of heat haze standing over asphalt in cities that were built for milder centuries. The orange, smoke-tinted skies of record wildfire seasons, photographed so often that the images have lost the power to alarm anyone. A sun the color of a coin behind particulate cloud. People walking to work beneath it, checking their phones. The warning was never that the sky would change. The warning was that we would watch it change. Name it, measure it, publish it, and continue. And that the heat, once it arrived, would begin taking things away, one at a time. Number 7. Water you cannot drink. The warning was delivered in the language of hydrology, which is why almost no one read it. The United Nations has projected that by the period between 2025 and 2030, roughly half the world's population could be living in water-stressed areas. Half. Not half of the poorest nations. Not half of the arid belt. Half of everyone. The projection was published in documents that received a fraction of the attention given to temperature forecasts, and it was filed by most readers under the category of problems belonging to other people in other places. The projection has already begun to arrive. Cape Town reached what its municipal authorities called Day Zero, the calculated date on which the taps of a major modern city would be shut off and residents would collect rations from guarded distribution points. The date was announced publicly. Citizens watched it approach on countdown clocks. Chennai, a city of millions, ran its reservoirs to mud and moved water by train. Mexico City, built on a drained lakebed, has rationed supply to entire districts while the ground beneath it subsides from the extraction of the water underneath. None of these are remote settlements. They are metropolitan centers with airports, stock exchanges, universities, and functioning bureaucracies. They are the kind of places that were assumed to be insulated by wealth and infrastructure from a category of failure understood to belong to the developing world. Beneath the American Great Plains lies the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest bodies of fresh groundwater on the planet. It was laid down over geological time by processes that no longer operate at any meaningful rate. It is being drawn out faster than it refills. Sections of it in Kansas and Texas have already dropped below the depth at which irrigation is economically viable. The farmland above it produces a significant share of the grain and cattle that feed a continent. The water beneath it is being spent, not borrowed, and it will not be replaced within any time frame that concerns a human institution. What makes the water warning particularly unsettling is not the scarcity itself. It is the visibility of the evidence and the collective decision not to look at it. The landscape has already begun to record the loss. Riverbeds crack into pale tiles, the surface splitting into geometric plates, the way old glaze splits on fired pottery. Reservoirs draw back from their shorelines and leave rings of bleached rock behind them, high, precise bands marking the level the water once held. These are not subtle markers. They are legible from the highway. They are visible from aircraft. A bathtub ring on a reservoir wall is a measurement, publicly displayed, of exactly how much has been taken and how little remains, and it is passed daily by populations who have learned to see it as scenery. Water scarcity was never supposed to look like this. It was supposed to look like distant villages and long walks and photographs from continents most viewers would never visit. Instead, it looks like a Californian city debating lawn ordinances. It looks like a Spanish reservoir revealing a drowned church. It looks like an insurance actuary in a wealthy nation quietly recalculating the value of farmland that has water rights attached to it. The warning was that the line between the developed world and the water-stressed world was not a line at all. It was a schedule, and the developed world was simply further down it. Number 6, eyes everywhere. There is no founding date for this one. That is the first thing worth noticing about it. Every other warning on this list has a moment of arrival, a threshold that can be pointed to, a year in which the thing that had not existed began to exist. Surveillance has no such year. It arrived the way silt arrives in a harbor. One camera at a time, each installed for a reason no reasonable person could object to. The bank installed one, because banks are robbed. The parking garage installed one, because cars are stolen. The school installed one, because parents asked. The intersection installed one, because drivers run lights. The stadium installed one, because crowds are unpredictable. The airport installed dozens, then hundreds, because the airport had been given a mandate no one was willing to argue with. Not one of these decisions was a conspiracy. Every one of them was a line item on a municipal budget, approved in a meeting nobody attended. Current estimates place the number of surveillance cameras installed worldwide at over 1 billion. The density is heaviest in urban China, where coverage in some cities approaches the theoretical limit of what public space can accommodate. But the technology is not regional. Facial recognition and AI-assisted monitoring are now operating in airports, in stadiums, in city centers across every continent that has electricity and a procurement process. The systems do not merely record, they identify. They match a face against a database in the time it takes the face to cross a room. And then the retailers began building stores with no checkout at all. You walk in, you take what you want, you leave. The store knows what you took, knows what you considered and set down, knows how long you stood in front of the shelf before deciding. There is no cashier, no line, no transaction in the traditional sense. The convenience is genuine. That is the point. The system was not sold as observation. It was sold as the elimination of waiting. What makes the surveillance case particularly unsettling is not the cameras. It is the absence of the argument. There was never a public debate about whether a society should be continuously legible to the entities that run it. There was never a vote. There was never a moment in which the question was put plainly to a population and answered. There were only 1 billion small approvals, distributed across 4 decades and 10,000 jurisdictions, each too minor to contest. Look up in any building you enter, the small black domes on the ceiling, the subtle green blink of a status LED in a corner you have walked past 1,000 times. You have stopped seeing them. This is not a failure of attention. It is the ordinary and correct response of a human nervous system to a stimulus that never changes and never threatens. The eye discards what is constant. The infrastructure of near-total public tracking was completed in plain sight, at eye level, in a shape the brain was designed to ignore. The people of any future studying this decade will not need to reconstruct it. They will not sift through fragments, guess at motives, argue over interpretations the way historians argue over the classical world. They will have the footage, all of it, every street corner, every terminal, every shop floor, every face that passed beneath a dome and did not look up. We are the first civilization in history to record itself completely. We did it without deciding to. We did it while looking at something else. And what we built to watch ourselves is now being handed to systems that do not get tired, do not blink, and do not need us in the room at all. Number 5. The warning about the robot workforce. The oldest warnings about machines were never about machines. They were about men without work. Every account of the future written in the last century, whether by novelists, engineers, or the various individuals who claim to have seen the coming decades directly, converges on the same image: a factory floor with no one standing on it, a loading dock at 3 in the morning, fully lit, fully operational, entirely empty of people. This was the standard vision of the far future for most of the 20th century. It was filed under science fiction. It was understood to be a story about somewhere else, sometime else, told to make a point about the present. It is now a description of a building you can drive past. Warehouse and manufacturing automation is surging across every industrial economy on Earth. Amazon alone has deployed hundreds of thousands of robots into its facilities, machines that lift, sort, carry, and route inventory in coordinated patterns that no human supervisor could hold in mind at once. These are not experimental installations. They are load-bearing infrastructure. The system does not function without them. The people who remain in those buildings work at a pace set by the machines, in positions defined by the machines, filling the narrow remaining gaps that the machines have not yet been engineered to close. And the gaps are closing. The current generation of development is not concerned with conveyor systems or fixed arms. It is concerned with bodies. Humanoid robots, including Tesla's Optimus and the machines being built by Figure, are in active development with commercial timelines pointing to the late 2020s. Bipedal, 2 arms, roughly human height, designed specifically to operate in environments built for human beings, which is to say, every environment that exists. The engineering logic is unsentimental. The world is already shaped for a body of a particular size and configuration. Build that body, and you do not have to rebuild the world. What makes this warning particularly unsettling is not the machines themselves. It is the compression of the timeline. Bipedal robots doing warehouse labor moved from science fiction to factory floor pilots in a period measured not in generations, but in a couple of years. There was no transitional decade. There was no public debate that concluded. There was a category of thing that existed only in stories. And then there was a video of that thing carrying a crate across a concrete floor. And the interval between those two states was shorter than a mortgage term. Analysts now project significant job displacement in logistics, in driving, and in routine office work by 2027, not in a distant restructuring, in the near arithmetic of the present decade. These are not marginal occupations. They are the load-bearing employment categories of the modern middle class, the work that replaced the manufacturing work that was displaced last time, absorbed by economies that promised the displacement was temporary and that new categories would emerge. There is a specific sound associated with this transition, and anyone who has stood near one of these machines knows it. The whirring of servos. The precise, slightly unsettling smoothness of robotic joints in motion. A smoothness that no biological limb produces. because biological limbs correct constantly, and these do not. It is a sound that registers, somewhere below thought, as wrong. Not threatening, wrong. The uncanny quality of watching something perform a human motion without any of the small failures that make the motion human. The warning was never that the machines would rise against us. That was always the comfortable version, the version with a villain and a resistance. The warning was that they would simply be better at the tasks by which we had learned to describe ourselves. A person is what a person does. That is how the arrangement has worked for as long as there have been arrangements. The question arriving now, at speed, is what a person is when the doing has been assigned elsewhere. Number 4, the silent bees. Every other warning on this list announces itself. The machines speak. The cameras blink. The robots whir. The warning delivered by the pollinators is delivered in the only register that human beings have never learned to hear. It is delivered as an absence. In the United States, beekeepers have reported annual colony losses that routinely exceed 30%. This is not a figure from a projection or a model. It is a figure from the ledgers of working commercial operations, recorded season after season, by people whose livelihoods depend on counting accurately. A loss rate of that magnitude in any other industry would be treated as a structural emergency. In apiculture, it has become a baseline. The beekeepers have adapted. They split surviving hives. They purchase replacement queens. They rebuild the losses each spring and absorb them again each winter. The numbers hold steady only because the labor behind them has quietly doubled. In Europe, the record is worse and stranger. Long-term studies of insect biomass conducted in protected nature reserves, land specifically set aside to remain undisturbed, recorded declines of over 75% across recent decades. These were not agricultural zones. These were not industrial corridors. These were the places designated as safe. The insects declined there anyway, in the protected ground, under the protection. Roughly 75% of the world's food crops depend at least partly on animal pollination. Not all of it, and not entirely. Wheat, rice, and maize are wind-pollinated and would survive. But the crops that carry the vitamins, the oils, the fruits, the nuts, the coffee, the substances that distinguish a diet from a ration, depend on insects moving pollen between flowers, because no machine has ever been built that can do it at scale for free. What makes the pollinator warning particularly unsettling is not the mathematics of the decline. It is the mechanism by which it stays hidden. A collapse of this size remains almost entirely invisible until it reaches the food supply. There is no moment of failure. There is no threshold that trips an alarm. There is only a field that is slightly quieter this year than it was last year, and slightly quieter the year after that, and a generation of people who grew up with the reduced volume and have no memory of what the original sounded like. This is the sensory detail that survivors of ecological baselines describe most often. The quiet. Gardens that once buzzed. Hedgerows that once required you to raise your voice. Summer evenings where the air itself had a texture. Windshields that had to be scraped after a long drive, an experience so universal in the 20th century that it required no comment, and so rare now that it has become a subject of study. Nobody notices a sound that stops gradually. The human nervous system is engineered to detect change, not level. A noise that fades across 40 years does not register as a loss. It registers as normal. And this is the shape of the warning. Every other collapse on this list will arrive with a signal. The economy will report it. The screens will show it. The institutions will convene about it. This one arrives with nothing. It arrives as a slightly emptier orchard, a slightly higher price, a slightly thinner harvest, distributed across enough seasons that no single season carries the blame. The people who study insect populations are not describing a future event. They are describing something already substantially completed, in a system that produces most of what we eat, in a silence that nobody heard fall. The warning was the quiet. The quiet was already here. Number 3. The space traffic jam. The warning was delivered in the form of an arithmetic problem, and for most of the last century, nobody bothered to solve it. In 1957, there was one artificial object in orbit around the Earth. By the end of the 20th century, there were a few thousand, most of them dead, drifting through a volume of space so large that the probability of any two of them meeting was treated as a rounding error. Orbit was understood to be empty. It was understood to be effectively infinite. It was the one frontier no one worried about crowding. That understanding is now obsolete. Over 10,000 active satellites currently orbit the Earth. SpaceX's Starlink constellation alone accounts for thousands of them, and the filed plans call for tens of thousands more. Other operators in other countries have filed comparable plans. Low Earth orbit went from mostly empty to genuinely congested within a single decade, and the decade in question is the one that just ended. The mechanism of failure was described before the crowding began. In 1978, a scientist working on orbital debris proposed that above a certain density of objects, collisions would begin to generate more debris than the atmosphere could clear. Each collision would produce fragments. Each fragment would become a projectile, traveling at several kilometers per second. Each projectile would eventually strike something else, producing more fragments. The process, once initiated, would not require any further human input. It would run on its own momentum. The condition is now known as Kessler syndrome, and its endpoint is not a disaster in the cinematic sense. Its endpoint is a shell of shrapnel around the planet, dense enough to make certain orbits unusable, not for years, but for generations. There would be no explosion. There would be no visible event. There would simply be a series of routine collisions, spaced across months, after which launching anything through the affected altitude would become an unacceptable risk. The door would close quietly, from the inside. What makes the orbital case particularly unsettling is not the scenario. It is that the early symptoms are already being reported by the people best positioned to notice. Astronomers have documented a steady increase in satellite streaks contaminating long-exposure telescope images. Observations that took years to schedule are being ruined by bright lines crossing the frame. The instruments humanity built to look outward are being obscured by the instruments humanity built to look inward, at itself, at its own communications traffic. This is not a projection. This is the current condition of professional astronomy. The rest of us have seen it without a telescope. Trains of bright dots gliding across the night sky in a straight line, evenly spaced, moving too fast and too steadily to be aircraft, visible to the naked eye from any dark field on any continent. A generation ago, that sight would have prompted emergency phone calls. It is now unremarkable. Most people who see it identify it correctly within a second or two and go back to whatever they were doing. That, in the end, is the shape of this warning. Every other entry on this list concerns a system on the surface of the Earth, and every one of those systems, in principle, admits of repair. Orbit does not. Debris at those altitudes does not decay on any timescale relevant to a human life. There is no cleanup crew. There is no second attempt. The species spent 4 billion years on the surface, and roughly 70 years with the ability to leave it. The warning is that the window may not have been a door opening. It may have been a door held briefly ajar, by us, and closing now under the weight of our own traffic, and we are the ones who filled it. Number 2, truth you cannot trust. The warning, in the telling that has circulated for years, was always the strangest of the set. It was not a warning about a weapon. It was not a warning about a war, a plague, a collapse in the food supply, or a machine that would take a man's work from him. It was a warning about evidence. The visitor, whoever he was said to be, told his listeners that the era they were entering would be the last one in which a recording of an event could be treated as proof that the event had occurred. He said the change would not arrive as a crisis. He said it would arrive as a convenience. For most of the century behind us, this was the least alarming thing anyone could have said. The photograph was the anchor of modern life. Courts admitted it. Journalists depended on it. Historians built the record from it. A recording of a man saying a sentence was, for practical purposes, the man saying the sentence. Forgery existed, but forgery was expensive, slow, and rare, and it left fingerprints. It required a laboratory, a specialist, and time. The forger was always outnumbered by the people capable of catching him. That arrangement no longer holds. Deepfake systems can now generate convincing video and audio of a real person in seconds. Not hours. Not with a studio. Seconds from a laptop, using tools that are cheap, fast, and available to anyone who wants them. The voice is right. The cadence is right. The small, involuntary movements of a human face under speech are right. What was once the work of a state intelligence service is now the work of an afternoon. Detection has not kept pace. It cannot. Every tool built to identify a fabrication becomes immediately a training instrument for the systems producing them. The forger learns from the inspector. The inspector learns from the forger. The gap between what can be made and what can be verified has widened every year of this decade, and the people building the detection tools are the first to say so. The consequences are no longer theoretical. Fabricated video and audio have already appeared in elections. They have already appeared in financial fraud, in which a voice that belonged to an executive and did not belong to an executive moved real money out of real accounts. The residue is still there for anyone who looks closely enough. A flicker at the hairline, a blink that arrives at the wrong interval, a shadow that does not agree with the light. But these are the artifacts of an immature technology, and every artifact is a defect being engineered out. What makes this warning particularly unsettling is not the fakes, it is the doubt. Analysts studying the trajectory place the crossing point in the late years of this decade, with 2027 appearing repeatedly in their forecasts, and the crossing they describe is not a world in which people believe lies. It is a world in which verifying reality becomes a routine, difficult, and frequently unsuccessful task. A world in which the honest recording and the fabricated one carry the same weight, which is to say, no weight at all. This is the condition the visitor described. Not a population deceived. A population that has lost the ability to be convinced of anything by evidence, and has therefore returned to believing what it already wanted to believe. Every society that came before us argued about what the record meant. Ours will argue about whether there is a record, and the systems producing these fabrications are not the most capable systems being built. Number 1. The thinking machine that outgrows us. The warning that arrives last is the one that has been arriving the longest. It does not concern a machine that speaks, or a machine that watches, or a machine that lifts pallets in a warehouse without complaint. It concerns a machine that reasons, and it concerns the year 2027, which keeps appearing without coordination in the private timelines of the people who are building it. The term is artificial general intelligence. It refers to a system capable not of one narrow task performed brilliantly, but of the full range of cognitive work a human being can do, performed at speed, without fatigue, without the biological limits that have governed every mind that has ever existed. For most of the last 70 years, this was a philosophical exercise. It was discussed in universities as a distant hypothetical, the way earlier generations discussed interstellar travel. It was not on any schedule. It is on a schedule now. The executives of the leading laboratories discuss it openly. They name years. They name resources. They describe thresholds they expect to cross. And the year that recurs in their statements, with a frequency that no one has adequately explained, is 2027. The evidence that something has already shifted is not speculative. These systems pass bar examinations. They pass medical licensing tests. They solve coding benchmarks that defeat the majority of professional engineers. Each of these thresholds was, at the time it was set, considered a reasonable proxy for genuine understanding. Each was crossed, and each time the goalposts were quietly moved because the alternative was to accept what the crossing implied. Governments have reacted the way governments react to things they do not understand and cannot slow. The United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have all rushed to draft safety frameworks and convene summits, assembling regulatory architecture for a technology whose capabilities change between the drafting of a document and its ratification. The urgency is the signal. Institutions do not convene emergency summits about tools. What makes this warning particularly disturbing is not the capability. It is the confusion of the builders. The people constructing these systems are themselves publicly debating whether the systems can be controlled, not whether they will be misused, whether they can be steered at all. This is not the language of engineers describing a product. It is the language of people who have opened something and are watching to see what emerges. They do not agree with each other. They do not agree with themselves from one year to the next. And they are continuing regardless, because stopping is not a decision any single participant is able to make. And there is the moment nearly everyone has now experienced without knowing what to call it. You ask a question. The answer comes back not merely fast, but insightful. It has noticed something you had not noticed. It has understood what you meant rather than what you typed. And for a fraction of a second, before the explanation reasserts itself, you have the distinct sensation that something on the other side is reasoning back. Every warning in this record converges here. The machines that speak, the vanishing cash, the overheating skies, the dry aquifers, the cameras, the robots, the silent fields, the crowded orbits, the collapse of verifiable truth. None of them required a time traveler. Every one of them is documented, dated, and available to anyone willing to look. The future is not being predicted. It is being built. It is being built this year by people who have not agreed on what they are building. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.